The plane was descending at 4,700 feet per minute. That is not a landing. That is the speed of a brick falling out of the sky. Inside the cockpit of the red and white Piper Saratoga, John F. Kennedy Jr. had just over 20 seconds left to live. His wife Carolyn was in the back row. Her sister Lauren sat beside her. They were 34 miles from Martha's Vineyard, 8 miles from the nearest land, and the Atlantic Ocean was a black wall in the windshield. Kennedy did not radio for help. He did not declare an emergency. According to the National Transportation Safety Board, he probably did not even know he was falling. This is not a story about a famous man. This is a story about a chain of small decisions, every single one of them legal, that have killed roughly 20 general aviation pilots every year in the United States, every year since this crash. The accident has a name in pilot training circles. They call it VFR into IMC. And the reason it keeps happening is sitting in your inner ear right now. To understand what killed John Kennedy Jr., you have to start at Essex County Airport in Caldwell, New Jersey on the afternoon of July 16, 1999. It was a Friday. There was a wedding the next day in Hyannisport, the Kennedy compound on Cape Cod. His cousin Rory was getting married, and the family was expected. Kennedy planned to fly his wife and sister-in-law to Martha's Vineyard first, drop Lauren off, and continue on to Barnstable Municipal Airport in Hyannis. It was a familiar route. He had flown to or from that destination roughly 35 times in the previous 15 months. He had done it 5 times at night. But this flight was different in 3 ways that mattered, and not one of them was illegal. The first difference was the AR plane itself. The Saratoga he was flying, registration N9253N, was almost brand new to him. He had purchased it about 3 months earlier, in May 1999. It was a Piper PA-32R 301 Saratoga 2 HP, a 6-seat single-engine plane with retractable landing gear and a constant speed propeller, powered by a 300 horsepower Lycoming engine. It cruised significantly faster than the Cessna 182 he had flown for most of his training. It was heavier. It handled differently. He had logged about 36 hours in the Saratoga total, and only 9.5 of those were at night. About 3 of those Saratoga hours were without an instructor in the right seat, and only about 48 minutes of his solo time in the airplane had been at night. The second difference was Kennedy himself. About 6 weeks before this flight, he had broken his ankle in a paragliding accident on Martha's Vineyard. On the day of the crash, his left foot was still in a cast. His ankle was injured to the point that, on a previous flight, his certified flight instructor had to assist with the rudder pedals during landing. The Saratoga uses rudder for crosswind correction and to coordinate turns. Flying a complex airplane with an injured ankle is not in itself a disqualifying condition, but it adds to a pilot's workload. Every input takes a little more thought. The third difference was the most important, and it is where this story turns from tragedy into a public service warning. Kennedy was a private pilot. He had earned his license in April 1998, just over 15 months before the crash. He had logged roughly 310 total flight hours. His private pilot certificate authorized him to fly under what aviation calls visual flight rules, VFR. That means he was legally allowed to fly only when he could see outside the airplane and use the natural horizon to keep the aircraft level. He was not instrument rated. He had completed about half of a formal instrument training course in the months before the crash, but he had not finished it. He had passed the written exam, but he had not earned the rating. The difference between a VFR pilot and an instrument rated pilot is not paperwork. It is the difference between flying with your eyes and flying with your ears, your hands, and a panel of gauges that tell you the truth when your body is lying to you. At Essex County Airport that afternoon, Kennedy called the weather service twice for a briefing. The forecast he received indicated visual flight rules conditions along his entire route. Visibility was reported between 4 and 10 miles. There was haze, especially along the coast, but no clouds at low altitude. Legally, this was a green light. He could fly. He was current. The airplane was airworthy. The weather was, by the technical definition, VFR. But here's the thing about VFR. weather at night over 30 miles of open ocean in summer haze. It is legal. That does not make it safe. And if you like aviation breakdowns that separate what was legal from what was actually survivable, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Now let's look at the decision that put Kennedy over Blackwater with no horizon. Kennedy and the two Bassett sisters arrived at the airport later than planned. The original plan had been to depart in the late afternoon while there was still daylight. Lauren had been delayed at work in New York City. Carolyn had been delayed too. By the time the Saratoga taxied out, the sun was already setting. The wheels left the runway at 8:38 p.m. The sun set on Long Island Sound at 8:14 p.m. He was flying into a black sky with the Atlantic Ocean below him, and the only visible reference he had was a thin band of haze where the water and the sky should have met but did not. The first 30 minutes of the flight were unremarkable. Radar tracked the Saratoga heading northeast at 5,500 feet, paralleling the Connecticut coastline. He flew past Bridgeport. He flew past New Haven. He flew past New London. The lights of southern Connecticut were beneath his left wing, a string of yellow pearls along the dark coastline. As long as he had those lights, he had a horizon. As long as he had a horizon, he could fly the airplane. Past Point Judith, Rhode Island, he had a choice to make. The safer route would have continued along the coast, around the western shore of Buzzards Bay, with ground lights visible the entire way. The shorter route was a direct line across roughly 30 miles of open ocean to Martha's Vineyard. Kennedy chose the shorter route. He had taken it before. He turned out over the water. For the first few minutes over the ocean, the lights of Rhode Island were still visible behind him. Block Island was off to his right. Then somewhere around 9:34 p.m., the last of the ground lights faded from his rear quarter. The haze thickened. The horizon, which had been a faint suggestion all night, simply disappeared. He was now flying inside what pilots call a black hole. Above him, no moon. Below him, water so dark it was indistinguishable from the sky, and in that moment, his eyes stopped being able to tell him which way was up. This is where the story becomes physiology. To understand what happened next, you need to know how the human balance system actually works. Inside your inner ear, there are 3 small fluid-filled tubes called semicircular canals. They are arranged at right angles to each other, one for pitch, one for roll, and one for yaw. When you move your head, the fluid inside these canals shifts, and tiny hair cells detect that movement. This system is brilliant for walking on solid ground, and it is catastrophically unreliable in an airplane. The reason it fails is that the semicircular canals only detect changes in motion. They do not detect sustained motion. If you are in a coordinated turn that lasts more than about 20 seconds, the fluid in the canals stops moving relative to the canal walls. Your inner ear concludes that the turn has stopped. Your inner ear thinks you are flying straight and level. Now imagine what happens when you decide to roll out of that turn. Your eyes cannot see outside. You bank the wings level. The fluid in your inner ear suddenly shifts, and your brain receives a signal that says you have just entered a turn in the opposite direction. Your body screams at you that you are now banked left, even though you are actually wings level. So what does the pilot do? He banks back to the right to correct. He banks himself back into the original turn. The airplane starts descending. He pulls back on the yoke. The airplane keeps descending in the bank, and the descent rate increases. The airspeed builds. The turn tightens. The pilot pulls harder. The bank steepens. And in less than a minute, the airplane is in what pilots call a graveyard spiral. This is exactly what the radar data shows happening to Kennedy's Saratoga. About 34 miles west of Martha's Vineyard, the airplane began a gradual descent between 400 and 800 feet per minute. About 7 miles from the approaching shore, the Saratoga banked into a right turn. The descent stopped at 2,200 feet, then the airplane climbed back up to 2,600 feet and rolled into a left turn. While in the left turn, it began descending again, this time at 900 feet per minute. Still in the descent, it rolled into another right turn, and during that final right turn, the rate of descent built and built until it exceeded 4,700 feet per minute. The airplane struck the water with its nose down. The impact was instantaneous. All 3 occupants died on contact. When divers reached the wreckage 4 days later, on July 20th, the bodies were still strapped into their seats. The reason the seatbelts told the story is that the airplane was not breaking up in flight. It was structurally intact. There was no engine failure, no fuel exhaustion, no mechanical malfunction at all. The Saratoga had been a perfectly functioning machine, flown into the ocean by a pilot whose brain could not figure out which way the floor was. This is the punchline of the NTSB report, and it is worth reading carefully. Almost a year after the crash, on July 6, 2000, the NTSB released its findings. The probable cause read like this: the pilot's failure to maintain control of the airplane during a descent over water at night, a result of spatial disorientation. Factors in the accident included haze and the dark night. That is the entire explanation. There was no conspiracy, no mechanical failure, no exotic chain of causes. A pilot lost control because his inner ear betrayed him. And here is the part that should keep every general aviation pilot awake at night. There is a study conducted at the University of Illinois in the 1950s that put 20 private pilots into a simulator and asked them to fly into simulated cloud conditions. Every one of those pilots was visual flight rules only, just like Kennedy. The study measured how long they could maintain control of the aircraft once they lost outside reference. The average time was 178 seconds, 2 minutes and 58 seconds. That is how long it takes for an untrained pilot to lose control of a perfectly good airplane in zero visibility conditions. Some pilots in the study lasted longer. Some lasted less. Not one of them survived past 5 minutes. The study became required reading for instrument students. It is sometimes called the 178 seconds to live study. And the reason it became required reading is that the FAA realized something disturbing. Visual flight rules pilots flying into instrument meteorological conditions were not just common, they were almost always fatal. In the year of Kennedy's crash, visual flight rules into instrument meteorological conditions accidents accounted for a small percentage of total general aviation accidents, but they accounted for a much higher percentage of fatal general aviation accidents. The math was clear. If you flew into clouds without an instrument rating, you were probably going to die. So why does this still happen today, almost 3 decades later? The answer is a combination of training, technology, and a psychological phenomenon pilots call get-there-itis. Let us take them one at a time. The training gap is the easiest to explain. A private pilot license in the United States requires about 3 hours of simulated instrument flight conducted under a hood that blocks the pilot's view of the windscreen. 3 hours. That is the entire instrument training a visual flight rules pilot is required to receive. It is enough to get the pilot back to visual conditions if they accidentally enter cloud. It is not enough to fly an approaching cloud. It is not enough to recover from a graveyard spiral once one has started. And critically, it is not enough to convince the pilot that their inner ear is going to lie to them. Plenty of pilots, when they finish that 3 hours of hood time, walk away thinking they could probably handle clouds if they had to. They are wrong. The 178-second study tells us how wrong. The technology has gotten better since 1999, and in some ways that has made the problem worse. Modern general aviation cockpits often have what pilots call glass panels. These are large color displays that show the pilot's attitude, altitude, airspeed, and navigation information in one integrated picture. Many small airplanes now have autopilots that can hold heading, altitude, and even fly and approach. In theory, this technology should reduce accidents in which pilots flying under visual flight rules enter instrument meteorological conditions. In practice, it has created a new problem. Pilots who fly behind glass panels and autopilots tend to overestimate their own competence. They assume that if they get into trouble, the autopilot will save them. Sometimes the autopilot does save them. Often the pilot does not engage it in time, or does not know how to use it under pressure, or fights the autopilot's inputs because their inner ear is telling them the autopilot is wrong. And then there is get-there-itis. This is the pilot term for the psychological pressure to complete a flight that should have been canceled or diverted. It is the most dangerous force in general aviation. Kennedy had it on the night of the crash. There was a wedding the next day. His family was waiting. The flight was already late. Lauren had to be at her drop-off. Carolyn had something to attend to. The wedding rehearsal dinner was that evening, and they were already going to miss it. None of those pressures were aviation pressures. All of them are normal life pressures, and they are exactly the kind of pressure that causes a pilot to look at deteriorating conditions, look at the clock and say to himself, I have done this before, it will probably be fine. The NTSB report on the Kennedy crash specifically called out personal stress as a possible contributing factor. The Aeronautical Information Manual contains a line that should be tattooed on every cockpit. Stress from everyday living can impair pilot performance, often in subtle ways. Distractions can so interfere with judgment that unwarranted risks are taken, such as flying into deteriorating weather conditions to keep on schedule. That is the entire Kennedy accident in one sentence. The aftermath of the crash was in some ways a missed opportunity. The Federal Aviation Administration did not issue any new regulations specifically because of the Kennedy accident. It did not require additional instrument training for private pilots. It did not change the rules about night flight over water. The legal framework that allowed Kennedy to take off that night is still the legal framework today. A non-instrument rated private pilot can still file no flight plan, take off into legal visual flight rules conditions, fly 30 miles over open water at night, and never speak to air traffic control. That is exactly what Kennedy did, and it is exactly what other pilots are still doing. What changed instead was the culture inside flight schools and pilot training organizations. The Kennedy crash became the case study that every flight instructor uses to teach visual flight rules into instrument meteorological conditions awareness. The 178-second study became more widely cited. The Federal Aviation Administration published an advisory circular on instrument flight illusions, Advisory Circular AC 61-27C, which is now studied by every serious pilot. There was a renewed emphasis on the 180-degree turn rule. If a visual flight rules pilot finds themselves losing visual reference, the only correct action is to immediately turn around and fly back the way they came. Not down, not through, back. And there was a renewed emphasis on the autopilot save. Modern autopilots, even basic ones, can hold a wing level and a heading. If a visual flight rules pilot loses the horizon, the single best action they can take before their inner ear has time to fail is to engage the autopilot and let it fly the airplane while they figure out what to do next. This is now taught from the earliest hours of flight training. It was not taught widely in 1999. Despite all of this, visual flight rules into instrument meteorological conditions, accidents still kill general aviation pilots every year. The Federal Aviation Administration's accident statistics for the past several years show roughly 15 to 20 fatal accidents annually that are attributable to non-instrument pilots flying into instrument conditions. That is one fatal accident, on average, every 3 weeks, just from this one cause. The pilots who die in these accidents are not all inexperienced. Some have thousands of hours. Some have advanced ratings. Some are flight instructors. The thing they have in common is not skill level. It is a moment of decision, where the pressure to complete the flight overrode the warning signs of deteriorating weather. They flew into the cloud, into the haze, or into the black hole over open water, and their bodies betrayed them. Many of them, like Kennedy, did not even radio for help. The pilots who survived these encounters tell a very specific story. They report that the moment they lost visual reference, they felt their brain pulling them in directions the airplane was not actually going. They report fighting the controls. They report feeling certain that the airplane was banking when the instruments said it was level. The ones who lived are almost always the ones who, in that moment of disorientation, made themselves trust the instruments instead of their bodies. Many of them engaged the autopilot. Many of them executed an immediate 180-degree turn. All of them describe the experience as the closest they have ever come to dying. So what is the lesson of the Kennedy crash 27 years later? The lesson is not that he was a bad pilot. He was an average pilot with low time in a complex airplane, which is a profile that describes a significant fraction of the general aviation population at any given moment. The lesson is not that he was reckless. He had a weather briefing. The conditions were legal. He had flown the route before. The lesson is not even that he was overconfident, although confidence certainly played a role. The lesson is something quieter and more uncomfortable. Aviation does not care about your experience, your family name, your reasons for being in a hurry, or your previous flights along the same route. Aviation cares about whether the airplane is flying straight and level and whether you, the pilot, are aware of that fact. When the natural horizon disappears, your awareness disappears with it, unless you have trained your hands and eyes to trust the gauges instead of your gut. That training takes dozens of hours under a hood. It takes a check ride. It takes an instrument rating. There is no shortcut. Every year there are pilots reading articles like this one, watching documentaries like this one, who think the same thing Kennedy probably thought when he taxied out at Essex County. They think, I have done this before. They think the weather is legal. They think it will probably be fine. They think, I do not have time to wait for better conditions or take the longer route. And every year, around 20 of them are wrong. Their families get a phone call instead of an arrival. The Piper Saratoga that John Kennedy Jr. flew into the Atlantic Ocean was not a bad airplane. The weather was not technically illegal. The route was not unusual. What killed him, and what is still killing pilots today, is the gap between what the regulations allow and what human physiology can actually handle. That gap is invisible from the cockpit on a clear day. It only opens up when the horizon disappears, and by the time you notice it has opened up, you have somewhere between 178 seconds and the rest of your life to figure out what to do. If you are a pilot, the takeaway is simple but hard. Get your instrument rating, even if you never plan to fly in clouds. Practice your autopilot procedures until they are automatic. Make a personal weather minimum that is stricter than the legal one. And the next time you feel the pull to take off in marginal conditions because you have somewhere to be, remember the Saratoga off Martha's Vineyard and the 3 people in it and the 4,700 feet per minute they were falling at the end. The reason that crash still matters is not because of the family name. It is because the same accident is waiting for the next pilot who decides that legal is the same thing as safe. If this kind of breakdown is the way you like to learn about aviation, subscribe. There is a deep library of accident analysis ahead, and the next case study is already in production. Fly the airplane. Trust the instruments. And if you are not sure, turn around.